Okay, so welcome everybody to the second session of our results-based accountability short course. Thanks for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Kate McGowan. Take it away.
All right. So why don't we start first with just addressing a couple of the questions that you've already named, and welcome to the new folks, and for those of you who watched the video, thank you for doing that. One thought I have about the Scott's question about the how wells and if the client aren't actually people. I've been actually thinking a little bit about that and remembering some of the conversation around that land or water can be the client. And I'm wondering, maybe one of the things that to tussle with is land and water and the environment really the population level piece and not really the client? And that might help separate it a little bit, and that's the ultimate end game, and you're choosing strategies that involve people, and those people are the clients whose behaviors you're trying to change. So that may be an interesting clarification to play with as you work your way through RBA. The other part about how well is it's not always just customer satisfaction. So if indeed land or water or something else or even people are the client, and you're trying to analyze the how well question of your work, it could include things like geographic reach. If you have some strategies around inclusivity or geographies or something like that, size of farms, size of water bodies, that there may be some sort of space around that about how well are you doing that, hitting something other than the easiest targets, if that makes sense, right? So that might be a way. The other piece that's often used is the timeliness or the accessibility of program services. So again, if it's coming down to people, are you meeting them where they're at in the way that they can resonate with and get to? Are you making them come to you, or are you going to them, right? In order to make it more user friendly. So those are just some other how wells you might consider. Becky, the short-term and long-term thing, yeah. And I think, again, one of the caveats in our first session I think we covered was, as you're thinking about your measures, making sure that your measures are actually doable in the time frame that you have people with you, right? So we may have aspirations for long-term change, but we may only have people in front of us for a short window, and that's the space that we probably reasonably can track stuff. And that's the point where you start relying on other people's research to sort of say, justifying your theory of change, to say, indeed, we know this works because someone else has done a long-term study, or this is the first step in a chain of events. We're going to measure the first chain and have faith. Now, if by some miracle you get the funding and the staffing to do longer term studies after you've lost track of those fakes, good. Those folks, go for it. But try to design your measures within the time frame that you have, and then look at other research to defend your case. So let me see if there's anything else on those questions. The big question from Stephanie, if this is the right fit, well, maybe we'll learn something, because this is a great opportunity to play with it and pilot it without too much risk, right? We talked a lot about risk last time. To play with it with one or two programs and see, is it actually helpful? Does it help you learn and pivot and make some changes? Is it easily used on the team? Those are questions I would look at if I was evaluating the use of a framework for the long term, and if it's worth the time to try to create a culture of using it. So I would use it as a short-term pilot to see what you take from it, and work with other people to have those conversations to see if it works. So with that, any questions or comments about those comments? We could go in circles all day. All right. So the other question, the other introductory question I wanted to ask, for those of you, well, actually anybody, all of you, for those of you who did your homework, and those of you who tried to do your homework but couldn't do the homework, what are the takeaways about the process of the brainstorming with a team around performance measures? Or what are the takeaways about what gets in the way of our good intentions when it comes to evaluation? And we can do popcorn unless nobody answers, and then I'll start calling on people. Oh, you guys are a silent crowd. You're gonna
Kate,
make a call on you, right?
Kate, can you just quickly remind us what you would like us to
To talk.
respond to? Yeah.
Yep. So the homework this week was to, we had worked a little bit on the performance measure quadrants and brainstorming how well is anyone better off. And the assignment was to go and work with somebody else, because RBA is meant to be conversational and a team process. So to work with either the team or somebody else in your organization to brainstorm how well is a better off. And also, if possible, to explain some of RBA to the team that you're working with so that they have a sense of it too. So that was the homework. And life also happens, it's real life. And evaluation and program work is real life. So for those of you who tried and weren't successful in doing that, there are learnings in that as well for your evaluation processes. So just because you didn't do your homework doesn't mean you're off the hook for thinking about it and sharing the takeaways. So anyone volunteering?
I got it on my board meeting agenda that we had. We didn't wind up getting into it to talk about it, but it was on the agenda. And
That's the first step.
yeah. We want to talk about the conference the whole time. But yeah, so I apparently need better time management. But we did look at it briefly, and people thought that it was really important, and the board was pretty excited about getting an opportunity to kind of think through this. And so we did commit to a retreat in February, specifically on some of these, like looking through, we already have a strategic plan, but kind of like backing them together and kind of looking at and asking ourselves these questions. So that was exciting, but I did get to spend some time with Jen. I just looked at the sheet that you gave me. The thing that's on Google, the shared documents,
Yeah.
that was, did we have that before? Because I'm sorry, because if that was my homework, I didn't do that part. I did the other, like, talking about it part.
So part of the homework was to finish up the brainstorming on your performance measures.
Okay.
How well is anyone better off?
So Jen and I then met about that and had a really long conversation and have, whiteboards of ideas that we want, kind of take as the platform to take it to the board.
So there's a celebration in that you took it to the board and they were receptive. That's a beautiful takeaway. Well done. And anything that got you stuck on the brainstorming of how well is anyone better off, or any ahas?
Oh, well, that was when we got kind of in the rabbit hole of whose data and where the data was. So I wouldn't say that we'd clarified all of those questions. We started really digging in what we knew, what we had as a big pool, what we knew.
Great, thank you. Who else wants to go?
I'm happy to go next.
Okay. Thank you.
So as I mentioned, I'm brand new to this process, and I believe Catherine also. So we're on the same team as is Lindsay Rule. We did not get a chance to meet as a group, but I know Catherine did some stuff, and I know I did some stuff on my own. The how much and the how well seemed to come more naturally. Maybe it's just that that sort of is in line with a lot of the grant reporting I do, so that felt more natural. It was the is anyone better off part that I struggled a bit more with.
Yeah, and I would say ding, 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 right on the button. That's right. Yeah. So the easiest ones and the one we're most familiar with are exactly those first two. And of course, the most important is anyone better off is the most important and the hardest to hang your hat on. So you're right on target with everyone else who's ever tried to do this. So bravo. And hopefully
Misery loves company.
Exactly. And hopefully that will get easier and you'll get more fluid in it. And as you start to hear some of them and start digging a little deeper, you'll find some things that make sense and you feel like you could hang your hat on and say, yeah, this is what we stand for in the work. So well done. Who's next?
Okay, I have something that's coming to mind. So part of the work, what I'm looking at is I've had to narrow my focus to my world in supporting faculty and staff in their planning and reporting efforts and assessing how well I'm doing. And in the is anyone better off category, one of the things that we sort of ended with last time was trying to define what high quality, like we have high quality, I'm looking for high quality impact statements and narratives. And so like putting some bounds around, like what does that mean? Like what does high quality mean? In a conversation that I just had this morning with one of our staff, program staff, was asking for just that, kind of looking for some guidance on what is it that I look for when I'm looking through narratives, what stands out to me. And so I think that feels related, that people are already asking for more clarity around what takes a narrative entered into our reporting system, what is it that I see that makes me want to pull that out and share it more broadly. And so I think there's something there that I can put some bounds around when I'm trying to define what high quality is.
And isn't it amazing when you have those conversations? I bet many of you have been on both sides of the equation, evaluating grants and writing grants. And really, it's so much better when we actually know what is excellent, because we don't want to waste our time and do less than excellent, right? It's a lot of effort. So to get that clarity and understand that as you define that, people will welcome it and help you create it. One thing, I imagine many of you, just by virtue of being part of Extension and UVM, are used to rubrics. So Stephanie, if you've worked at all with rubrics, the exercise that you can go through, I have a book, let me see if it's right here. It's by David Grant. And I'll try to send it to you. Let me make a note. And he spent a lot of time working on rubrics and has some exercises about sort of thinking about what's good. Like, as you were saying, like, what do I pull out and say that is good? And you ask yourself a series of questions, and that gets you to this is a really lovely column on my rubric. And then you go to the next level and say, so what's even better than that? So you can target excellent. And it's very descriptive. It's different than RBA. I think it supports RBA when you're trying to guide and build a roadmap to how to get to those measures and be successful. So creating those rubrics or having those actual descriptions in your instructions might be a really helpful process for you to go to. But let me make a note of David Grant's book.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Does that make sense to think about it that way?
Yeah, it absolutely does. I mean, it means more thinking, but great.
More thinking. We're doing more frames. Peeling an onion, you just get deeper and deeper, and it's really great. It doesn't really make you cry all the time. Maybe it's more like a rose petal. All right, who's next? Anybody else got something to share about homework or not doing homework?
This is Nina. I was just going to share that I think one of the biggest takeaways from our last meeting was kind of the recognition that we have both willing and unwilling participants in our programs, and that it's important for us to look at evaluating those differently. And that the metrics and measurements we use to do that are going to look really different. And kind of as far as like putting this into the homework and stuff, it's really just been kind of identification of areas that we need to survey. And that we need to design some specific ways to look at those populations differently, rather than kind of putting them all together.
Because it really won't be effective if you have two distinct sets of clients, and that you also are probably working with them. You have different strategies for the willing and the unwilling, right? And then there's also how much effort resources you want to apply to it. That's a great space to land. And
yeah, and I don't think we've really, that recognition isn't fully there yet, that we have two separate client bases. We definitely look at everything as one kind of whole group of clients and people that we serve. So just kind of stepping back and saying, okay, let's just at least try to think about this, and can we, use different metrics.
Right. And how do you define success for each of these different pools of people? Because they're very distinct. Excellent. Thank you.
Did you come up with any yet, Nina? Like, did you think, because it just kind of made me laugh because I was like, right, the unwilling, there will be no sense of customer satisfaction. Like,
Well, I think I'm stuck on the like actual management change or intent to change. And if we're working with unwilling participants, it's more of that like trying to convince them it's a good idea or that it's going to benefit them in some way. So like just trying to change their perspective and get them to a point where they have intent to change. And maybe it isn't actual management change, whereas that's where we look at a lot of our other program success is like we're seeing change, we're seeing implementation, and there's dollar signs incorporated with it, and there's phosphorus numbers incorporated with it. But it's the behavioral piece I would hope that we could focus on for the unwilling more as far as helping them understand the benefits.
And this might also be an opportunity to use a matrix as well in terms of what's the movement along that the degree of acceptance and willingness to might be something that could be created and useful as well. But it may be two different things. The other place that this fits in, and we haven't gotten there yet, is if you remember on the overall handout, sort of the one pager with the accountability boundary line in the middle and the 7 questions. When we get to the place where we're doing the turn the curve, which is the actual analysis of your data, there's the section called story behind the story, right? So you have your data and then you start actually having a narrative about it. You may end up with your program having the same measures, but the story behind the story may be we had 80% of our clients this round were unwilling participants. Right? So that skews the data. And so understanding the breakdown of the forced compliant folks and the ones who are just engaged and interested may be the look under the hood of the data as well. So you could either track it separately and or include it in the narrative piece as you're trying to understand what's going on. All right.
I had the same thoughts along the lines of Nina's comment. I feel like I need a broader matrix than this homework sheet for teasing apart the different kind of levels of participation that we engage with. And I feel like I see that there's the one side of like unwilling, and I'm very hesitant, like because I'm not a regulator, like we're just working with voluntary people, to kind of bother them or bug them to follow up and kind of pull out that satisfaction piece or the change piece. And that's very challenging for me in my work, is to that nagging follow-up with very busy farmers who I have a lot of social capital with, and so I err on the side of not bothering them. And then on the flip side of that, there's a lot of people who I feel like I shouldn't take the credit for their behavior change. Like it's something they were going to do anyway, and they were already on the path, and I just happened to meet them at the right time and engage with them at the right time. And that's been challenging for me as well. So on these kind of measures, there's a couple people that I'm like, oh yeah, they they're satisfied, their attitude changed, they've implemented all these practices, and I don't feel like it's directly connected to my work. So that's also kind of, I feel like I'd like a broader matrix than this to kind of pull those things apart.
So for you, there may be something about an initial assessment that puts them someplace on this gradient of willingness and knowledge, depending on what you're doing. Is it attitudinal, is it behavior, is it knowledge, right? Those are the better-offs. There may be something that you can do that either by observation or by assessment places them somewhere, and you're measuring movement along that, the assumption that not everyone's starting at the same place. So
yeah.
that may be part of how you have to design it in order to again have some credibility as you report the data or as you're analyzing the data. And again, remember, this is all for the intention of getting better at what you do. Right? So if you're deluding yourself, you might as well not do it. So
right.
If it's a really hard look at yourself and understanding, where did people start? What have I learned about that starting place? What are the interventions that work when someone presents this way versus this way? What's reasonable to track and move, and what are the right interventions? That means you're doing program improvement. So there may be an initial assessment that would help, a post-assessment. And then also getting back to what we talked about a long time ago in the program when we're looking at surveys is the ethics of surveys for very busy people. And so always asking yourself, is there another way to get this data, right? Is it something I can observe or someone else can observe? Is there some other mechanism? And if I'm surveying or taking someone's time, can I get what I need in 3 questions in 3 minutes? Does it have to be 40 questions in 4 hours? Can I ask the question once, not 3 different ways, and get really respectful in how we're gathering data from folks? And your folks and your social capital will build, especially if you start talking about it like that, right? Like, I have 3 questions for you. That's it. Please help me on this one. Right? All right. Who have we missed? Anybody left?
Can I just jump in for a minute on both Nina and Becky's thoughts? I recently have been part of a project that is developed a pathway diagram about new farmer development, and the idea was to sort of have both the on-ramps and the off-ramps for as farmers are doing things. So, and looking at those, so it kind of, shows like some of the places where people get off or where they get on to the programming, and how it all, with the goal of it being a successful beginning and established farmer. So thinking about your on-ramps, but also your off-ramps, like what things trigger people to not continue to get it. Like what are those, like what is going on at that point where they leave? And sometimes, like with beginning farmers, it could be a very positive decision that they don't want to make a livelihood farming. It might be different in your cases, but just sort of, it's a big process to think about that kind of pathway diagram, but it might be a help of identifying the questions, not that you ask of them, but you ask of yourself, of what's happening there. With that, I'll let you move on, Kate.
Perfect. All right. So everyone who had something to say had the chance to say it. All right.
Kate, can I just ask a really quick follow-up to something you just said in response to Becky's question about, spending social capital? And, I really appreciate your response about sort of like, there are different forums, and in some cases you might need that, that really short, distilled 3 questions that is a 3-minute long response. And something that I really struggle with is, and, I find is almost there seems to be like mixed messages I'm getting, and I don't know that I'm gonna get the answer to this now, but how do you distill, down to the essence of, a 3 questions, 3-minute response, so that you can get a really meaningful response from whoever you're working with? And others I talk to, I know, struggle with the same thing, and I don't think there's one right answer, but that's something that I hope to at some point, get some progress on my learning.
Yeah. So I think there's no one answer, right? And so depending on what you're trying to get at, sometimes it's a little bit like the conversation last time about, is it a broad reach or a deep reach, right? So that's part of the answer, as well as what is your strategy and how will you prove its efficacy, right? And so if you need to have an in-depth interview with participants in order to get that depth of understanding, well, then that's what you need to design for, right? If, on the other hand, it's a broad thing, and it's really what you focused on is, did you learn something? You can simply ask, did you learn something, and what did you learn? If it's about behavior, what did you learn and how did you apply it? And are you being consistent in it, right? So or you go and you observe them, right? And so you don't even have to ask them, you see it. So asking, again, RBA, part of the promise of RBA is, the idea behind it is that ultimately it gets you to the crux of what you're trying to do. And that rather than measure 400 or 40 or 25 different measures, you're really hanging your hat on your theory of change and your specific strategy and what you really intend to do. And that's what you measure. And I think often what happens is we have special interests, or we have special funders who have a particular question they're trying to get an answer to, and we start building it up like a tax code. And then we look back 5 years later and go, I don't even know why we're asking this question. And so there's something about RBA that says, let's get to the heart of the matter. And what do you say you're doing? How are you going to know you're doing it? And what do you actually have to ask and measure to get there? And all the other stuff is fluff. And unless you're required to do it because a funder is doing it, and we talked about this last time too, if you have to do it, you have to do it. But you don't have to spend any time on it. Right? You just collect it and hand it off. But the stuff that's telling you something about what you're doing is the part that you focus on and you analyze and you have conversations about. And we can't have conversations about 50 data points and actually respond to them. I don't know any organization that can do that. I mean, if you know one, great, I'd love to see it and learn how they do it. I haven't been able to do that, and I haven't seen it happen well. So what we're really responding to is what's actually pointing us in the direction, and how do we respond to that so we can get better and do better work. And then the question is integrity, about how do we gather that information in the least intrusive way possible. I don't know if that answered your question. Okay, cool. All right. So today, we're going to move on from the brainstorming part to this next part of RBA, which is the culling process. So the first part is brainstorming. And if you haven't finished the brainstorming process in collaboration with others, I would really recommend you spend some time doing that. Because again, RBA is meant to be conversational. It values the wisdom of the room. It values having people not so attached to your work that you're looking for confirmation bias, right? You're going to get what you think you're going to get. So you bring some outsiders in and some people with different quirky perspectives than your own, and you come up with some really great ideas. And that list hopefully is pretty robust. And the hardest part about that is it also feels like overwhelming, and you get to stop being overwhelmed because you're not going to actually measure all these. These are all the possibilities that that might point you in the right direction. And if we pull up, if you have access to, do you want, Beth, do you want me to bring it up on the screen, or do you want everyone to look at it individually, the handout for today? I could try to share my screen, but you want to
I think sharing your screen would be great. That way it will be in the recording.
Okay, let's see if I can make that happen. I have two screens, and I think sometimes that doesn't make Zoom very happy, but let's see what we can do. If I share, I'm talking out loud, sorry, welcome to my outside external brain. See, that's not it. How about that? Are you seeing the handout?
I was seeing it before. Now I see the list of people. Yeah, there we go.
There we go. Okay, so it looks different on mine. Okay, so again, part of the promise of Mark Friedman and his work is let's stop doing so much and make it really effective. And he talks about headline measures. This is a little complicated in complicated systems with multiple programs, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And the other part he doesn't do very well is explaining how you get down to a manageable number from this brainstorm list. So what I have found to be very helpful is a two-part culling process. So first you brainstorm, and then you go away. So if you've had your team in, you leave that first meeting. Maybe you do this over the course of 2 or 3 meetings, but at least 2. You invite everybody back, and after you've had the first brainstorm without constraints, you take a look at that list again. And you say, is there anything, when you were, how many times have you left a meeting and said, oh, I should have said this? Or you wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, that's the perfect measure. When you've done that, you know that you've really become an RBAista. And you ask for any new ideas. Is there anything else that's emerged since you've been mulling this over? And let's add that to the brainstorm list. You also take a look to make sure that you have everything in the right place. That as you look at the list, are the how muches really how muches? Is the better offs really about your own quality of work? And are the, is anyone better offs measuring the impact on the client in terms of behavior, knowledge, skill set, or situation? So you make sure everything's in the right place, add things. Then you also have a really intense conversation about what does this language mean, right? And so we heard a little bit today from Stephanie about what is high quality, right? What is satisfaction? So having some real clarity about what does this mean to each person at the table, because sometimes as you start to vote, it's not so much about a disagreement about the idea behind it. It's more about what does it actually mean? So getting some clarity about those definitions becomes important as you start to negotiate the favorites. And then everybody gets to vote. And so if you have, let's say you've come up with a list of 30 between all three categories, you'll decide how many do you need to narrow it down to. And it might be 7 or 8 or 9. So you can give folks, 6 or 7 votes. They can do dots or check marks or any kind of thing. And you have that first pass to get the first call. And if you have a different way in your organization of making those kind of decisions, use whatever's familiar. But I think most folks are familiar with just putting up on a board and putting a check mark or a sticker on, and that seems to work. And then the second calling process has to do with the data criteria. So I'll pause for a minute. Any questions so far on the process?
I just want to make sure, are we talking about all of the performance measures? How much, how well, and is anyone better off?
Yep.
Okay.
So, and here's one rule of thumb. Everybody, actually I should add this, everybody has to vote for at least one how much or how well and better off. So how much is, when I'm leading a group through this process, I'm like, you can keep all the how muches you want, right? They're easy. You have a system in place for the how muches. They probably don't take that much time. Keep them. Let's not even talk about them necessarily. But everybody has to vote for at least one, how well are we doing? And at least one, is anyone better off? Because again, we're trying to move from our habits of just how much is into the other spaces. So I tend to just ignore the first quadrant, unless you have, such a huge amount of them that you need to call those down because they're draining your resources. Any other questions? Okay. So the second part of the process is based on some data criteria. And there's, let me see if I can make this, can you see that whole thing again? I can't really see what you're seeing. Is it a good view, Beth?
I can see down to data power and could there be quality data available? I don't know if
that's it. That's good.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
So he has, Mark uses 3 criteria for data. And the first one is communication power. And this one is really about your capacity to tell your story. Does it resonate with a broad number of people? So again, the more people you bring into the conversation to sort of test and haggle over the language of it, the better, because you're getting multiple perspectives. You're already doing your testing of the language about it and what the meanings are. Is it jargony? Hopefully not, because if it's jargony, as you try to communicate this out to the community or the people you serve or the people who are funding you, they won't get it. So the avoidance of jargon is a beautiful thing. And the one that I feel, and Mark doesn't talk about this because he's not a Vermonter, but does it pass the town meeting test? And by this, I mean, and maybe for him it would be the town square. When you go to town meeting and you're going to ask your neighbors for funding for your program, would it make sense to them? Could you explain it to them? Could you just say it that this is how we know we're successful, and they get it? The proxy power, and if you recall what we talked about, I think a little bit, was that there's never the perfect measure, right? The only way to get the perfect measure is if we live with someone 24/7, we block all external impacts on their life and their choices and their behaviors. We're their whole life for the rest of their life. We aren't probably going to do that. They probably don't want that. So we're going to get as close as we can. So proxy just means that it is of central importance to our theory of change and the work, that it actually informs the work that we're doing, and does it get us as close as we can get. And so as you're doing this work, you'll find that there's measures, again, remembering that time frame. We have someone for a week, we have someone for a month, we have someone for a year. How long do we have them, and what can we reasonably be expected to track? With a day or a week, it might be some new knowledge. With a quarter of a year or a year, you might get to behavior or attitude, somewhere in the middle there. So what can we reasonably expect to get, and how close does it get to the most important part of our theory of change? And then the final one is data power. And this one sometimes can confuse folks. So what we mean here is, can we get this data on a reasonable, can we get it regularly? Is it going to be accurate? Do we have the capacity to collect and analyze this data in a way that we can be consistent and timely? And these data criteria also apply to population indicators, and this data power piece is more important probably on the population level, because you're going outside of yourself to your own organization often to get that data. So if it's intermittent or somebody's not reliable, or you don't think they're going to do that again, that's probably not a reliable source. If it's data that you're collecting, you have some control over that. It may come down to how many resources do we have? Can we do those surveys? Can we do that observation, et cetera? But you have the power to decide how much capacity you have for the data collection. The other thing that sometimes hangs people up on this when they're evaluating it is, do we have it now? And you don't actually have to have it now to rank this high. It just means that you could fairly quickly, without getting more resources, rearrange yourselves and collect that data regularly. That you have someone who could do it, you have the computer to do it, you know, whatever it is. So you may not actually have it now, but you have the capacity to get it. So I'll pause. Any questions about communication, proxy, and data power? Usually there's questions about proxy, if anyone has one that they can articulate. And I can't see all of you, so if you're raising your hand, I won't know. Okay, no questions?
I have one question, Kate. This is Nina. How important is it that this process happens outside of the initial brainstorm? We're always like trying to fit things in and do them quickly. And I'm just wondering your opinion on, like, is this absolutely need to be a completely separate conversation?
I think you could do it in the same meeting, but I would make a distinction between brainstorming and then hemming, or hedging, right? So brainstorming by nature, we automatically go and say, we can't do that. They start to sit to that immediately on the brainstorming. So if you can say, we'll get to the evaluation of these options later, but don't limit yourself now. And because often what happens in groups, they limit themselves to what they're already doing, which, as we know, may or may not actually have any high quality. The quality of what we're already measuring is sometimes good and sometimes bad. So without hedging or limiting at the brainstorming, and then you could do a second part of the meeting to say, okay, now let's evaluate it.
Along those same lines as what Nina just asked, I'm kind of curious. I'm sure there are parts of this process that can be done remotely or by email versus ones that you want to be doing in person, and so I'm kind of curious, where each part sort of falls in that spectrum.
So you could, I think it's you can do it with technology now. You could do a Zoom meeting and you can co-create a Google document and have that interaction. So again, depending on the culture of your organization and how used your team is to being fully participatory using tech, you could do it that way. If it's a stretch for them, I would say there's something juicy in getting together and having the conversation about dreaming about what we might measure. And the energy will build off of each other. So people start to hear things and that triggers a new thought. So it depends on how adept your team is, or the folks that you're working with are at just jumping in online and making that happen. But you could use tech easily enough. And then again, Google Docs, you can, if we have time today, we'll play a little bit with that voting online on that other empty grid. We'll take somebody's homework and we'll plunk it in there and maybe go through that voting part, and then maybe some of the proxy. Depends on how much time we have. Okay. Anything else? Okay. Sometimes the proxy power is described like democracy, which I have started not to use the analogy so much, but in its ideal state, a democracy, we elect an official who presumably represents us well. And that's a little bit like these data points. We elect them, we put them forward, and they represent us as they represent a lot of different components of the work, but they kind of get to a couple parts of the work that we're doing, and hopefully all in alignment. So one way that you can track this is once you've done the first call, so you've done your dots exercise or your initials exercise, and you've come up with your top 8 measures, probably skipping the how muches. So 5 to 8 maybe on the how well and is anyone better off. You list them here on the left-hand column, and note here again, you have to have at least 1 how well and at least 1 is anyone better off. You can do something that talks about current status. This often bogs people down too. I've used red, green, and yellow components sometimes. Red meaning we don't have it, we have nothing on this, brand spanking new. Yellow means, you know, we probably have parts of it, and if you gave me a week, I could go to all the different Excel spreadsheets in our surveys and I could probably pull up something. And green is something that you already have at the ready. Somebody could go to a computer or their desk and pull the data right now. This isn't necessarily necessary, but often on teams, it's sort of a bubbling criteria. So